Welcome to Vineyard Boise. It's our vision to make the invisible God visible wherever He places us. We come together on Sundays to worship and fellowship corporately. But we know that church isn't just about Sunday. It's about a lifelong, day-to-day following of Christ with other believers. We invite you to join us, just as you are. If you'd like to support our ministry, visit vineyardboise.org and click the Give Online button.
This morning, I want to take a moment to report to you, a few weeks ago during our table time, we had some time where we were just kind of doing a workshop at the tables. And we said, this is kind of new for us. If you're new, we haven't always sat at tables. We did in the very early days of the Vineyard, and then we switched to rows, and we had just rows of seats for a long time. And pretty recently, we grafted back into this environment of tables. And we said, while we're doing this, we have a choice to set a culture. We get to engineer what kind of culture do we want to have for ourselves, with one another, but also for those who come as guests, for those who come as visitors. What kind of culture do we want? And so we did a workshop at the tables and said, how do we nurture a culture of hospitality and loving inclusiveness? And so over the next few weeks, I've been trickling out some of those responses. And so what I want to share with you today was a response that actually a lot of you had, and I've kind of condensed it into 3 sayings, but many of you said something along these lines. So it was basically this: come early, stay late, invite someone to lunch. Okay? Let's try it again. Come early, stay late, invite somebody to lunch. Here's the come early part. The come early part is there was a number of those, but one person said, I've been enjoying coming early and actually talking to people before church starts and finding out who's going to be at my table and beginning to engage in conversation. Probably that person was an extrovert. But here's what the introverts are finding as well, myself included, my wife included, is that actually these tables are actually pretty conducive to introverts because we don't have this huge sphere of people we have to interact with. It's just very defined. It's just this circle of people. And we get to have meaningful conversations. So that was come early. I would also say, just from a logistics perspective, it's much easier to find a table before church starts. Because once the worship team starts leading us in worship and we're all standing up, it's hard to see where the empty seats are. So I would encourage you to come early, grab a cup of coffee, and then the stay late part was actually accidental. Somebody said, you know what, I didn't think I was going to like the tables, and then I ended up having a conversation with someone that I wouldn't have had I not been sitting at a table. And not only did we talk during the scripted time, like the provided time for talking, but we stayed afterwards and talked. And it's that reality that if we're sitting in rows, it's pretty easy to not engage with other people. But when you're sitting at a table, it's awkward to not talk to the people at your table. And so we find ourselves talking, and I liken it to the whole dynamic that happens that now that we have garage door openers, we can drive home, open the garage, pull in, wave at the neighbor, close the garage without ever saying hi, right? And it's that appearance of friendliness, but actually no real substance to it. And when we're sitting at tables, we actually end up interacting. And so stick around, talk to people, and you might just find that this is especially brave, but you might have an opportunity to invite somebody out for lunch, to a restaurant, to your house. But and there was a time in our culture where people did that at church, where they got together after church, not just during the formal time, and you might find yourself with that opportunity. So there you go. Well, we're kicking off a new series today. It's a series on identity. It's going to be about 7 weeks long, and it's going to carry us forward all the way to Easter. Okay, Easter falls on April 1st this year. Our team's already planning Easter, and we're pretty excited about the possibilities with the April Fool's Easter. I mean, come on. Think about that. There's some potential there, right? Not really dead. But for the next 7 weeks and up until then, we're going to be doing a series on identity. And it's not actually a shift from where we've been. The last 4 weeks during January, we were doing a series on really on our vision for 2018, but really our vision for who God's calling us to be, even moving forward beyond 2018. And one of the things that we've been talking about, we've been using the language of uncharted territory. We're talking about what does a church do when we're moving into uncharted territory? And what we mean by that is the landscape around us that we live within is changing. There are seismic shifts happening in our culture, in politics, in religion, in education. Like our world is just shifting and it can feel pretty disorienting. And so as a church, what does it mean to live in changing times where there's so much shift happening? And what are we called to? That's what we've been talking about for the last 4 weeks. And I would say the challenge for us is twofold. One, it's to recognize that the world that's in front of us, and we've been talking about heading west, so the world in front of us looks very different than the world behind us. Okay, the world that we're moving into is very different than the world that shaped us, that we've experienced. And so what that requires us to do is to acknowledge that, because it may be that some of the things that worked for us in the past, and we're thinking specifically of like our models for doing ministry, some of the things that used to work, that used to even excite us, may not be as exciting as they once were. They may not be as effective as they once were. So as we move into a new landscape, as we move into uncharted territory, we're giving ourselves the permission to adapt, to experiment, and find out what's going to be relevant in this culture. Our staff, as a staff team, our pastors, we have an email that we were bouncing around the other day, and one of the things that we were talking about is we want to manage a tension. We want to manage the tension between being a church that's culturally relevant, meaning we want to reach our culture, but that is also countercultural. Culturally relevant and countercultural. We want to live in that tension between those two things. So one of the things that requires us to do is to adapt. And as a staff, we were watching a video series this Tuesday that's just helping us to be more thoughtful about the times in which we live. And the author of that, he used some language and he said this. He said, the calling of the church in any age, so whether the landscape is shifting or not, the calling of the church in any age is to be the presence of God's love in our time. To be the very presence of God's love in the absences of our culture, in the places where there's hate, to be the presence of love, right? To be the presence of love in our time. That's just a different way of saying the same thing that we've been saying, that we're called to make the invisible God visible. We're called to be a place where God's love and God's mercy and God's power is bursting forth into the culture. So, what does our identity have to do with that? Why are we doing a series on identity? And it's this. Because we can't faithfully carry out who we're called to be to others if we don't have clarity who we are to ourselves. It's to the degree that we have clarity amongst ourselves and with ourselves about who we are, that then we can go out and then be the blessing we're called to be in the world. To be the presence of love in a time that's full of a lot of hate. So, we're going to be talking about identity. I would say that, what we do always flows out of who we are. Doing comes out of being. So even the Apostle Paul, when he writes letters to churches, he never starts with doing. Okay, he never starts with application. He doesn't start the book of Corinthians and just start correcting all the things that are broken in their church, which there was a lot of material there. He had a lot he could work with. But he didn't start there, and in any of his letters, he always starts with, this is what God has done in pursuing his broken creation, breaking into his fallen creation. Here's what he's doing. Here's what you've said yes to. Now here's how that lives out in your lives. So he always called them to a place of understanding their new identity, and then he called them to live according to that. So we're going to be in this series on identity. We're going to keep going through the book of Joshua. We're doing some character studies, and this week we're going to be in chapter 9. I would encourage you, if you're not familiar with our model, we have a discipleship model that's really not dependent on Sunday. We have devotions that are at the back of the room on both sides of the doors as you leave today. Pastor Mike actually writes those for us. And they're a devotional guide that are about the passage we're going to be in the coming Sunday. So if you're engaged in the devotions, we call them green pastures, because it's just places for God's flock to graze and to eat. And it's good grazing. And if you're doing that, then by the time you come in on a Sunday morning and you hear somebody else talk about the passage, you've already been in it yourself and made space for personal encounters with God. And honestly, that is so much more important than what happens here. It's the personal encounter with God that's important. So I would encourage you to lean into that. In the season we're in, we're trying to make space for more things in our service together. And that does mean we're spending less time in the passage. We're condensing the way we teach through the passage. So leverage those devotions. They're really, really good for you. Okay, so we're going to be in Joshua chapter 9. Here's the historical setting and context for the story we're going to read today. This is the second generation of Israel. After the Israelites left Egypt, this is now the second generation, and they are at long last entering their uncharted territory, which is the Promised Land. Thus far, they have had two battles. They had one smashing success and one smashing defeat. And here's the thing that they're learning. They are learning that they have to continually be seeking God's will and God's presence in this new season, that they can't have one good victory and then think, okay, that's good, now we've got it from here. They have to keep leaning into God's presence, keep searching for his guidance. And so out of that, they cleaned up the situation after the smashing defeat, and they circled back to Ai, and then they followed that up with a time of covenant renewal, this time in the Promised Land. And now as we begin chapter 9, it's time for their third campaign. And there's a summary. We're going to begin this chapter with a summary of how the inhabitants, the local people that live in the Promised Land, how they're responding. So let me just set this up by saying that typically, as they're moving into the Promised Land, it's not a vacant space. There's already inhabitants there. That strip of land that we often know as Palestine, there were people who lived there. And there was a lot of little city-states, little independent city-states that often were at odds with one another. They didn't all coexist in harmony. But when Israel came into the Promised Land, they recognized we have a vested interest in uniting together. So most of the city-states, they're going to unite to fight against Israel and Israel's God. But there's one little group of people that decides to handle things differently. And our story today is about them. Verse 1. As soon as all the kings who were beyond the Jordan in the hill country and in the lowland all along the coast of the great sea towards Lebanon, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, all the ites. As soon as they heard of this, they gathered together as one to fight against Joshua and Israel. But, and here's our contrast, when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and to Ai, they on their part acted with cunning. They went and made ready provisions, and they took worn-out sacks for their donkeys and wineskins, worn out, torn out, and mended, with worn-out patched sandals on their feet, and worn-out clothes. And all their provisions were dry and crumbly. Repeat a word? Oh, don't make me read it again. Worn out. Yeah, the repeated word, the repeated phrase there was worn out. Okay? And so they're putting a lot of effort into cultivating an image. They're managing their appearance. Their clothes are worn out. Their sandals are worn out. The suitcases that they're carrying are worn out. Okay, everything's worn out. They're cultivating an image here, right? You know what it is? It's castaway. That's what they're aiming for. They want to look bedraggled. They want to look tattered. They've got Wilson with them. Wilson! All right? Hey, these guys are crazy. Here's why. They went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal, and they said to him and to the men of Israel, "We have come from a distant country." Now, these are some of the neighbors that are about to encounter. "We have come from a distant country, so now make a covenant with us." Okay, we're going to pause there and just kind of pull back and talk about the kind of the wide-angle view of Scripture. And what's happening, and here's where, as Christians living in 21st century America, we often struggle with some of the Old Testament stories. Because we're about to see Israel enter into the Promised Land, and they're going to enter in as an invading army, and they're commissioned to actually attack the locals. And as Christians, we can struggle with that because we know throughout the Scripture that God calls us to be what? Well, his presence of love in our time. And to reflect his love. And we have, teaching of Jesus where he teaches us to not only love one another, but to love our enemies. And so we struggle with this, but we need to understand that there's an unfolding happening throughout Scripture, especially in the Old Testament, that there's a progressive revelation where God is enabling mankind to understand our situation, to understand the desperateness of our situation, the human condition, that because we're fallen, because we rebelled against our Creator, we've invited the curse of sin and death, and we're now under God's judgment. And apart from his intervention, all of mankind faces judgment, not mercy. Okay? That's the progressive revelation. And at this time in the story, it seems like Israel has the kind of the moral upper hand, like they're the good guys. That's till we get to the next book of Judges. And we find out that no, everybody's in the same boat. And so what's happening is Israel's coming in, and they're not only coming in to receive the inheritance, the promised land that they've been waiting for hundreds of years now. Not only are they getting the promised land, but they're being sent in as God's instruments of judgment. God has said for hundreds of years at this point, there has been unrestrained violence, wickedness, rape, murder, child sacrifice. There has been unrestrained sin in this people, and I'm sending you as the instruments of my judgment. Okay? So when the locals know that Israel's coming in, they're not just looking at the people group, they're thinking about the God that is behind this people group. And that's the worldview of the time. The worldview was that there were many gods. This was not an atheistic time in human history. The people of the promised land, they were very theistic. They just believed in many gods. Okay, they believed there was gods over every territory, over every people group, and who had the upper hand just depended on whose God was the strongest. And so now as Israel comes in, it is the judgment of the God of Israel upon the inhabitants. Okay? So they're asking for a covenant. They come and they put on this masquerade that they've come from a long distance. They ask for a covenant. The people of Israel have been told they are not to make a covenant with the locals. They're not to make a treaty. They're not to establish peace because they're being sent in as God's judgment. Okay, verse 7. But the men of Israel said to the Hivites, "Perhaps you live among us. Then how can we make a covenant with you?" They said to Joshua, "We are your servants." Okay, pay attention to that phrase. "We are your servants." And Joshua said to them, "Well, who are you? Where do you come from?" They said to him, "From a very distant country your servants have come because of the name of the Lord your God. For we have heard a report of him and all that he did in Egypt." And they go on to talk about, we've heard of what your God did over the gods of Egypt, over the gods of the wilderness, over the gods on the other side of the Jordan, the God of the Amorites. We've heard of the power of your God, and we're afraid. And so we're coming to you for peace. And what follows is that the people of Israel are fooled by their masquerade. They're tricked into thinking that these people do come from a distant place, that these are not those local people that they're not supposed to make a treaty with. They think they've come from a distant country. And so in the passage, there's an implied rebuke that the people of Israel didn't stop to consult with God. They just operated on their own wisdom, their own cleverness. They evaluated the situation. They made their own analysis, and they said, here's the logical thing to do. And in so doing, they put themselves in a difficult situation. So we're going to fast forward to the moment when the Israelites discover that they've been deceived and that these people are not from a distant country, that the Gibeonites are actually their new neighbors. Verse 16, at the end of 3 days, after they had made a covenant with them, they heard that they were neighbors and that they lived among them. But all the leaders said to the congregation, "We have sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel, and now we may not touch them." If we were to read the entirety of this passage, I'm skimming over a few parts, you would hear the repeated phrase of covenant, of treaty, of promise, of oath. It's like 10 times in this passage. And the issue is that even though this treaty has been entered into under false pretenses, the issue is that the Israelites have made a promise, and they attach that promise to God's character as a covenant-keeping, promise-honoring God. See that? We have sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. And so even though this treaty was built on a deception, if they don't keep their oath, then God's name, his character, his nature is being represented as worthless and powerless. So Israel's called to honor it because even though these people have not operated with integrity, God's honor, his covenant faithfulness, it is not derailed and it is not contingent upon man's integrity. We should just pause and thank God for that. That God's faithfulness to us is not contingent upon our faithfulness or our integrity. Amen. There's application there. Verse 20. This we will do to them. This is the leaders of Israel. This we will do to them. Let them live, lest wrath be upon us because of the oath that we swore to them. And Joshua summoned them, this is the Gibeonites, and he said to them, "Why did you deceive us, saying that you are very far from us? We are very far from you, when you dwell among us. Now therefore you are cursed, and some of you shall never be anything but servants, cutters of wood, drawers of water for the house of my God." And so what Joshua says is, because we entered into this in good faith and you deceived us, there's now a curse upon how you've handled this. And it's a curse of your own making. It's a prison of your own making. By your own words, you said, and they say it like 5 times in the passage, they say, we are your servants. Then that is exactly what you'll be. And so for the rest of their life within the nation of Israel, that's their place. And it was a fixed lower class status in a class-based society. Verse 24, they answered Joshua. He said, why did you do this? They answered, because it was told your servant for a certainty, the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land from before you. So we feared. We feared greatly for our lives because of you, and we did this thing. And now behold, we're in your hand. Whatever seems good and right in your sight to do to us, do it. This is God's word. So this surfaces actually a lot of questions. We're going to look at 3 questions today. 3 questions are this. First of all, what did happen? Secondly, what could have happened? And then third, how can we learn from this? So first of all, what did happen? Well, confronted with the reality that they were under God's judgment, the Gibeonites respond differently than their neighbors. In other words, all the people groups in the land are hearing the same stories. It's all kind of rumbling around. They heard about what God did for his people in Egypt. They heard about the wilderness. They heard about the Amorites on the other side of the Jordan River. And so everybody's deciding how they're going to respond, how they're going to react. And most of their neighbors, these independent city-states, they decide we're going to fight God. Okay? This is the condition of humanity today, where people oftentimes will come into a revelation or acknowledgement that, you know what, there is a creator. I think there just might be a God. And some people, when confronted with the reality that there is a God, there is a creator, that we have accountability, decide, I'm just going to fight him. They do that through their posture, through their lifestyle, through unwillingness to submit to God. And so many people live that way. They acknowledge there's a God, and they just choose to fight. The Gibeonites do something different. Although there's some integrity missing, they at least acknowledge that there is a God, and they want to peacefully coexist with him, but they don't want to come to him in honesty. They don't want to come to him or his people with integrity. They want to actually do it on their own terms. And so they effectively put on a masquerade. Their solution, I want you to notice, it has both a payoff and a cost. Okay? What was the payoff? They were allowed to live, right? All of the other neighbors, they decide to fight God and they get destroyed. So the payoff is, in fact, and really their situation, they were right to fear. But they chose a solution that had both a payoff and a cost. What was the cost? Slavery, right? Joshua actually describes it as a curse. Now you have to live in a prison of your own making. The question we have to ask is, could there have been a third option that would not have carried the same cost? Is there not a third option that could have had a payoff that wouldn't have had the same cost? What could have happened? So as we look at that, let me just say this. When we study narrative, that's the story parts of Scripture, oftentimes we're told what did happen, not what should happen, not what could happen. And if you just know that, it helps when you read the Old Testament stories and even some of the New Testament ones, because oftentimes we come across characters that we think are supposed to be the good guys, but they're doing pretty slimy things. And that's the honesty of Scripture. It doesn't tell us what should happen. It tells us what did happen. And then we have to infer, okay, what should I learn from that? And so what could have happened here, where we're not told, but let's ask this question. Is there a more authentic way that they might have handled this that would not have relied on deception or of presenting a false image that would have allowed for a relationship with Israel and their God that was based on truth? Is there a way they could have handled this that would be based on truth? I'd suggest there is a third way. The author of Joshua is being very selective. He's not telling a comprehensive history of everything that happens as Israel comes into the promised land. He tells a few stories that make a point. And he's already told one story back in chapter 2, the story of Rahab. And Rahab was in a similar situation where she and her city, they all had heard the same stories, Egypt, wilderness, Amorites. They'd heard the same stories. They too were living in fear. Everybody in her city of Jericho decides, we're going to fight this God. And she decides, the handwriting's on the wall, I'm just going to throw in my lot with him. And we looked at that story a few weeks ago, and she had the clarity of the moment to say, I don't know everything about this God, but I see that he's more powerful than anything else I've ever encountered. And so I'm just going to throw myself fully in his boat. All right? She told them, meaning the spies that she encountered, what she understood of God's character, and then she just asked to be spared. And through her actions in protecting the spies, she effectively chose sides. She switched sides. As a result, she and her family got grafted into Israel with full status. As we continue to read the story of Rahab and we follow it through the New Testament, not only does Rahab and her family get grafted into Israel with full rights as citizens, she becomes the great ancestor of the King David and ultimately an ancestor of Jesus. That's the degree to which she was grafted in, not as a servant, but with full status. So if she and her family could be grafted in, even though God had said, don't make a treaty with the locals, if she could just come and acknowledge who God is and say, save me, could that not have happened for the Gibeonites? Had the Gibeonites come and asked for peace on the basis of the reputation of the Lord of Israel, might not they also have been granted in with full status, as opposed to self-proclaimed servants? So what can we learn from them? Well, from the Israelites, we can learn that we should keep seeking God's wisdom. This is especially a leadership lesson. The leaders of Israel failed to consult God. They had success, and then they just thought, maybe not a conscious thought, but they just stopped relying on God. They stopped seeking him. And there's a leadership lesson for all of us that even in times of success, that's maybe when we're especially vulnerable to becoming independent and not seeking God's counsel. You can pray for the leadership of this church that we will continue to seek God's presence at every step, and that he'll keep us on a short leash, that when we start to drift off into independence, that he'll pull us back. That was a failure of the leadership of Israel. Here's the thing, though. We can also learn from the Gibeonites. What can we learn from them? Their story, along with Rahab's, gives us the opportunity to consider the value of authenticity and the cost of projecting a false image of ourselves to others. In the same way that the Gibeonites chose to hide their true identity out of fear, we also can be prone to wearing masks that seemingly keep us safe, but ultimately may cost us far more than we gain. Let me just say that again. In the same way that they chose to hide their true identity out of fear, we're prone to wearing masks that seemingly keep us safe, but may ultimately cost us far more than we gain. And unlike their disguise was literal, it was very cultivated, it was very intentional. Oftentimes, we don't necessarily consciously choose our masks. In fact, sometimes they might even be blind spots. We do it without even thinking about it. Oftentimes, they're fear-based reactions, maybe even coping mechanisms because of real or perceived threats. But when we become aware of these masks, when we realize that we're presenting a false image of ourselves, to one another, to the world, then we have a choice. We can stop and say, what's this costing me? What's this costing us? What's this gaining us? And do we want to keep doing this? When we become aware of our masks, the ways that we're hiding our true self, we have a choice of whether we want to continue in that behavior or if we would like to change a position. A few years ago, I had an experience, several years ago, and I've worn many masks in my life, and at times still do. This one was effective. It was very powerful because it was a blind spot. It wasn't a mask that I realized I was wearing. And the situation was this. Pastor Try, who was our founding pastor here at the Boise Vineyard, had invited me and Andrea, invited us into a leadership transition where over a series of several years, we were going to transition the leadership of the Vineyard Boise. And in doing that, we really wanted to be healthy. We had never wanted or saw ourselves in this role, didn't expect that. We were surprised by it. But as we began to say, well, we think this is actually God's calling, it's not just Try's idea, but it might actually be a God idea, we thought, you know what, there's too much writing on this for us to not be really healthy people. So let's put ourselves in some environments where we can deal with our stuff. And so we did just that, and what I discovered was a blind spot, and I was really surprised by it, which I shouldn't be because that's the nature of being a blind spot, right? I wasn't aware of it. but you could have knocked me over when I realized it, because it was a mask that I wore that I didn't really wear consciously, and it was actually a mask I wore to myself more than anyone else. It was this. Throughout my life, I've been put in leadership positions. Starting from a young child, I would be put in leadership roles in my class at school, in my Sunday school classes, in our church that I grew up in every role I found myself in, people would put me in leadership roles. And I never really believed that it was really about me. The reality is I had an older brother that threw a pretty big shadow. And I always, deep down, I just thought, well, they're just doing this because they think I'm like Chad. And because Chad's a leader, they'll put me in these positions. And so I ended up doing things. I ended up being, in the church productions. I ended up being one of the primary actors. In school, I was in yearbook and student council and yearbook editor. And I found myself in all these roles. And then as I moved on out of high school through college and university and going to missions and stuff like that, I kept finding myself in leadership roles. And now here was our senior pastor asking me into a leadership role, a bigger leadership role than I'd ever had. And the reality is, I didn't feel like a leader. In fact, deep down, I suspected that someday they're going to figure out I'm not a leader, and then I'm in trouble. And the reason why is because I measured myself by other people. I measured myself by my brother, by Pastor Tri, by people I respected and looked up to, or whoever the current leader was in my life. Maybe it was Rick and Melanie. It was different people in different seasons. But I would always inwardly measure myself by those people, and I would never measure up. And I would think, I'm not really a leader. And I had this silent tape that played in my heart and my mind, I'm not a leader. And so when Tri asked me to do this, the biggest fear in my heart is, oh, crap. What if they find out? And I think the reason it was such a blind spot is nobody else did it to me. Nobody was putting that on me. Nobody was coming alongside and saying, you need to be more like Tri. You should be more like Chad. It was all in here. I was doing it to myself. And so what I found is I had to then pretend like I was a leader, because deep down I knew I wasn't. And I would go to work every day and I would put on the mask of leadership. But when I got home, I was just me. And I knew I was just clocking in, clocking out. And in that moment when I realized what I was doing to myself, honestly, it was a God-given epiphany. God asked me a question. He said, Trevor, do you want to keep doing this? And then he said, I don't need Tri 2.0. The church doesn't need Tri 2.0. The church needs you to figure out how to be the best version of yourself, to grow into that leader. And that's going to be the healthiest thing for you and the healthiest thing for the church. And honestly, just being aware that I did that, the power that freed up in my life was amazing. The freedom of not being in this prison. I remember sitting in meetings where Pastor Tri was leading, and I would watch him lead, and I would think, oh, I wouldn't have led like that. I wouldn't have seen that. I wouldn't have operated that way. And then I would just leave just crushed because I'm a failure as a leader. And the meeting wasn't even about me, but it's all happening up here and in here. When I discovered the mask, I had a choice what to do with it. And I can just tell you, over the last several years, it's been so freeing to start growing into who God's called me to be, not defining myself by somebody else. Brandon Freeman is a local filmmaker, part of our church here, historically part of our staff, now as a volunteer, but he created a movie for us, a mini movie. He and Brandon, another Brandon, created a little movie for us featuring some very talented local actors that helps us think about the choices that we make. Wow. We have a choice. We're in a moment in time right now as a church where we're defining our culture. We get to choose, with God's help, what kind of culture we will have together. Will it be a culture of authenticity, a culture of reality where we're real with one another, and because of that, we're growing in Christ likeness. I'm going to ask Greg Prosh to come up. Greg he has a couple claims to fame. In addition to being a good friend, he's also married to our phenomenal youth pastor, Sharon Prosh. And together, Greg and Sharon lead some ministries called Marriage Renovation and Teen Renovation that are all about living out of our identity. And they also lead our youth ministry, which, by the way, the high school group meets tonight. So welcome, Greg.
Thank you. Well, hello, Vineyard family. I'm fine. Thanks for asking. How are you? These masks, we can all wear them, can we not? In the 6th century BC, Greek actors would take stage and they would act multiple roles because in those days the acting troops were very small, 2 to 4 people at most, and so they would play multiple roles and they would use masks, much like these, to portray the different characters at the different time throughout the play. The Greek word that we used for these actors was hypokrites, which we get the English word hypocrite from, which means to be a pretender or a deceiver. Sometimes when I wear a mask, I do so to project something about myself that isn't true. And I do this when I feel insecure or that I don't meet up, and I'm generally trying to meet the expectations of what I think other people want. And I do this to gain their acceptance, their admiration, their affection and love. So I'm trying to be someone I'm not to please others. I can wear masks like, I'm fine, my marriage is fine, my family, fantastic, I've got it all together. At other times, I might wear a mask that suggests that what you said didn't hurt or bother me. No, that's totally fine. I'm strong enough, I'm smart enough, I'm courageous enough, I can do whatever it is that you're asking of me. My spiritual life? Oh, my spiritual life, let me tell you about that. It's great. God and I, we're tight. We're like this. At other times, I can wear a mask to protect, to hide my true self from others. I do this when I'm ashamed. I do this when I've done something that I feel guilt or shame over. I do this when I'm engaged in something I feel shame over. And I'm trying to hide my true self from others because my fear is that if they really knew me, if they really knew the things that I'm struggling with, then they wouldn't love me, they wouldn't accept me. Have any of these examples struck a chord with any of you? If I'm honest, I have worn every single one of these masks myself. I wore a mask that I was fine. I was really in debt up to my ears at a time. I've worn a mask that I hid the fact that I might have one too many glasses of wine than I should. I've worn a mask that I am just the perfect example of a husband, and yet there have been times where I have treated my wife terribly with my words and my actions. And so we can all wear masks. One of the things we're going to do is, and we've been doing this for a few weeks, is we've been doing exercises that allow us an opportunity to really reflect upon what it is that's being taught on Sunday morning. And so we're going to do that this morning. And before you go there, no, we are not going to ask you to share any of the masks with the other people at your table, okay? So just go ahead and take a deep breath and just of relief. But what we are going to do is we're going to ask you to reflect for a moment on some of the masks that you might be wearing. Okay, some of the masks that you might be wearing. At your tables, you'll see a curiously stamped envelope that you may have noticed in the center there. And inside, you'll find some cardstock masks like the one that Pastor Trevor had on for a moment this morning. First service took a lot of these, so you might not have enough at your table. So if you have extra at your table, will you look around and see if anyone at a table next to you could use some more? And if you are in need of extra masks, just look for those who might have them. If all else fails, grab one of those offering envelopes and just use that. But please don't write on the tables, okay? No writing on the tables. All right. So hopefully everyone will have a mask here shortly and a pen to write with also. There's pens there in the jar. Okay. All right, this exercise is going to be just between you and God, okay? So you can write small, you can write illegibly, you can use acronyms, code words, whatever you want. It's just between you and God. Keep your eyes on your own paper, or mask in this case. And again, we're just going to ask you to reflect on some of the masks that you might be wearing. So on one side, I want you to write the word protect. The word protect. Just right there at the top in the middle, write the word protect. And when you've done that, just go ahead and turn the mask over. And on the other side, I want you to write the word project. The word project. Okay. So in a moment, when I say go, here's what I want you to do. On the side labeled project, I want you to identify things about myself that I project to others that are not true. Things about myself that I project to others that are not true. And just go ahead and begin writing them down now. Go ahead. Okay, just another 30 seconds, if you will. 30 seconds. Okay, just finish up there, and then when you're done, I want you to go ahead and turn the mask over to the other side. Side labeled protect. Okay. Again, in a moment when I say go, I want you to write things I protect or hide about my true self. Things I protect or hide about my true self. Okay, go ahead and start writing those things now. Let's take about 30 more seconds. Okay, go ahead and put those pens down. So I just want to share with you for a moment some truths that we know about masks. I've got a book. The book's titled The Cure, and it's not available in the bookstore right now, but they can be ordered. So if you're interested, it's a fantastic book on the power of God's grace in our lives and how it can help us to take off masks we might wear. Some of you might have known this book as True-Faced. It's since been republished again as The Cure. So here are some truths that we know about masks. First of all, as Trevor illustrated with the passage about the Gibeonites in Joshua chapter 9, wearing a mask puts us in bondage. It puts us in bondage. Another thing is that wearing masks, it can be exhausting. We've got to create all these elaborate masks, and then we have to spend tremendous amounts of mental and emotional energy keeping them in place. Pastor Jeremy shared last week a very personal story about the cost of wearing a mask in his life, and that was, if nothing else, an incredibly compelling story about the cost of wearing a mask. Sometimes we put a mask on out of a justifiable necessity. For example, in our origin stories, oftentimes as children, the only way we can cope with certain situations is to put a mask on. But the tendency is to keep wearing those masks and relying on them throughout our life. And I think we can all think of somebody that we know that's still wearing that mask, that all of my life's dysfunctions, and I've done this myself, can be blamed on my victimization 20 years ago. That's a costly mask to wear. Sometimes the only one I'm fooling when I wear a mask is myself. Everybody else sees right through it, but I go on wearing the mask. Wearing masks, this is an interesting one. It artificially raises the bar, raises the standard for everyone around me in our culture. We see this in church a lot, right? We've got this standard that we've got to live up to, that we are creating when we wear these masks. Wearing masks proclaims that this Christianity thing doesn't really work. When we wear masks, then it must indicate that what we're believing doesn't really ring true, that it doesn't actually work in people's lives. But the truth is that we are designed not to wear masks of a false self, but rather we are designed to be image bearers of Christ. When I take off my mask, I allow myself the opportunity to grow deeper in relationship with others. I don't know about you, but when I watched that video, there was a turning point in that video, wasn't there? Where they're all around the table together, and one of them is brave enough, courageous enough to take off the mask. And look what happened. It led to others being free to do the same. And so that's the next point. When I take off my mask, I free others to do that. And finally, when I take off my mask, I allow God to begin further transforming me into his image and displaying that for others. In 2 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul tells a story. He's actually referring back to Moses. And Moses goes up on Mount Sinai to get the law. And he comes down, and he's been in the presence of God, and his face is radiant. And so to protect the nation of Israel from becoming blind, he wears a veil over his face. And interestingly, Paul refers back to this veil as, and he refers to the glory as being as fading. And so it's quick to jump to the conclusion that that's what Moses was hiding. But actually, Paul is making a point about the fact that the law, even at the moment of its institution, was fading and being replaced by Christ's glory. That's kind of the point of the passage. And so what we can take from that is that when we put on a mask, it is in fact an imposition of the law. A law which in a sense Christ freed us from. And so Paul was saying that when Moses was read, when the law was read to this day being his day, that a veil covered their hearts. And I think the same is true for us, that when we live under the law, we place a veil over our hearts. But Paul goes on to say that it was Christ that and his sacrifice that set us free from that. And I want to pick up in verse 16 of that chapter, and it says this: "But whenever anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom." We sang about that in worship this morning, about the chains being broken. "And we all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory are being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord who is the Spirit. Therefore, since through God's mercy we have this ministry, we do not lose heart. Rather, we have renounced secret and shameful ways, and we do not use deception, nor do we distort the word of God." I was taught years ago that you should have a key point when you speak, and so my key point would be this, and I hope if you don't remember any of the other things that I say this morning, that you would remember this one point, and that is this: I can only be loved to the degree that I am known. I can only be loved to the degree that I am known. The biggest danger in wearing a mask is that I might succeed, because when I put on a mask and I wear it, I'm doing that to gain the love and acceptance of others. And if I succeed at that and I gain their love and acceptance, then I have just imprisoned myself, because I've made it impossible to receive the very thing that I wanted in the first place. Because when they love me and accept me, I know in my heart that what they're loving and accepting is not really me. It's just the mask that I've presented to them. And so wearing masks actually isolates and imprisons us, and it works against us and others. There was a study done on end of life, and the number one thing that people regret at end of life, the number one thing, that I did not live a life true to myself. I did not live out of who I was. The heart of God is that we would stand before him with unveiled faces, and that through Christ's sacrifice for us, that we would take off the masks and that we would free others to do the same. That is God's heart for us. He knows us better than we even know ourselves. He doesn't see the mask, and he's able to love us perfectly, but he wants us to experience that love for each other. Okay? And so I think, we all know these two things to be true. Maybe there's no huge epiphanies for anyone this morning. We all know them up here in our head, and yet we don't really maybe understand them in our heart. And I think the only way we can do that is through experience. We've got to take that first step. We've got to be willing to take off the mask and see what a life could be like living unveiled. And so here's an opportunity for growth for us this week. This is what I would challenge you to do. Go to God, go and say, Holy Spirit, would you show me any masks that I might be wearing that I'm unaware of? Or maybe I'm aware of these masks. Show me where I can start and take these masks off. And also who, Lord? Who can I do that with? Look for someone in your life that you trust, or maybe that you're willing to begin a trusting relationship with. And ask God to show you who that person is this week. And be willing to take that step and take your mask off with them. Could I get hurt in this process? Absolutely. I could share a confidence and that could be betrayed. But what do I have to gain? That was the question that Trevor raised about the Gibeonites. What could they have gained? What could we gain if we began to take off the masks? Freedom, peace, deeper and more meaningful relationships with each other, a more intimate experience with our God. In a moment, the prayer team is going to come up on either side under the screens. And I hope that you would think of this as an opportunity to maybe take that first step and just say, God, would you search me and reveal to me how I can begin living not a life of deception, but just one of authenticity and freeing others to do the same. And just let him show you. And maybe for you, you're ready to do that now. And so I would invite you, if that's you, to just come forward and find someone on the prayer ministry team and just share with them where you're at. Okay? All right. Thank you for your time, and have an awesome week.